All right. Well, we left off last time in the middle of 1 Kings chapter 7, and we've been going through the construction narrative of the temple. And along the way, we've been showing some pictures so that we can get a kind of a better visual idea of what the temple might have looked like. And I joke, of course, that these were real photographs that were taken back then. But we understand, of course, that a lot of this is, some of it's artists imagining, and no matter what you do, you have to take a degree of artistic license while depicting the temple, because there's facets of the temple we have no idea what they look like. We don't know what the roof looked like, for instance, because nothing's really said about it. And we don't really know a lot about the construction of the outer court or the inner court here, because there's not a lot of data on it. To review very, very quickly, we have, of course, the temple blueprint. This is just the basic layout of what we're looking at. It's three pieces. There's the porch, there's the holy place, and then there's the Holy of Holies. You can also call them by their Hebrew names, the Ulam, the Hekal, and the Debir, but I don't know what the... I'm not going to get into that. There's also a series of side chambers around the temple as well, as these were described in chapter 6. And the side chambers get bigger as you go from one level to the next. You'll notice that the bottom level was only 5 cubits wide, the next level was 6 cubits wide, and the third level was 7 cubits wide. And the stone exterior wall was built to kind of contain that, more or less. The interior was plated all around with gold. The most holy place had cherubim. We don't know exactly what cherubim looked like. Here's a couple of guesses. But one thing we do know, based on the biblical text, is that they each had a wingspan of 10 cubits total, and that they were laid end to end. They would touch the walls of the sanctuary. So that's kind of what we're dealing with the cherubim in the most holy place. The door frames were kind of this recessed, one layer inside another. We looked at a comparison between Solomon's house and the temple, and we noted that Solomon built a luxurious temple and also built his own house, and actually several pieces to his house, which are each larger in size than the temple, which we noted was strange. And while the temple used a lot of cedar, it was Solomon's house that had the distinction of being known as the Forest of Lebanon. It's kind of odd when you consider that the whole reason for the temple in the first place was because David's going, I'm dwelling in a paneled house and the Ark of God's in a tent. Solomon's response is, okay, let's build a paneled house for God and a bigger paneled house for me. Well, there might be some issues with that. There were 2 pillars on the outside of the temple. They were known as Yakin and Boaz, which Yakin means he has established, and Boaz means in his strength. And I guess just kind of reminders of who had really established this. Well, the Lord had established Solomon as king on the throne, and the Lord had established the temple. Otherwise, unless the Lord is building the house, well, the people who build it labor in vain. This was not mentioned in Kings, but the bronze altar is mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. I just realized the scripture reference up there is wrong. It's 2 Chronicles chapter 1. If you read 2 Chronicles chapter 4 verse 1, sorry. If you read 1 Chronicles 4 verse 1, you're going to read a genealogy. But if you read 2 Chronicles 4 verse 1, you'll read about the altar. And the altar was 900 square feet and it was 15 feet tall. And while no ramp or staircase is mentioned, unless they're building a human pyramid, they have to have some way of getting to the top of this thing. Now, we come to the sea. That's where we left off last time. The sea, in verses 23 through 26 of 1 Kings chapter 7, was made of cast metal. It was 10 cubits or 15 feet from brim to brim. Its height was 5 cubits. That's another 7.5 feet high. 30 cubits in circumference, which would be 45 feet. And you'll note, we noted last time the imprecision of the mathematical measurements here. Under its brim, gourds went around encircling it 10 to a cubit, completely surrounding the sea. The gourds were in 2 rows cast with the rest. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on top of them, and all their rear parts turned inward. It was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup as a lily blossom. It could hold 2,000 baths. And we talked about the design of the sea last time, but let's talk about the significance of it. What would have been the point of this? Why is this thing here? Okay. It was for the priests to wash in. Chronicles specifies what's going on. The sea was specifically for the priests to wash in, while the other basins in the courtyard were for other people to wash in, according to 2 Chronicles 4 verse 6. Yes, Jen? Yeah, that's a good question. You know, some people have speculated that the oxen were like water fountain dispensers. I have no idea. That's just a guess. And admittedly, we don't know. We do know, and I'll bump a slide up for a second. They had these in the courtyard as well. These were basically these wheeled carts that had water bowls in them. We're going to look at that in a minute. How did they fill them? I don't know. Maybe they were somehow filled by the big sea in the middle. But I don't have a definite answer to that. The text, it's one of those weird things the text doesn't tell us. It simply tells us in Chronicles that the priests washed in the big sea, but it doesn't tell them how water gets from point A to point B. You got it? Well, you know, we're not really sure why Jeroboam picked the calf. I mean, it was kind of the calf was kind of a common animal for the gods to personify themselves as in ancient Near East. You know, it was a symbol of strength in certain cultures in that era. And so, I mean, it could have been anything, any reason why Jeroboam picked that. It was the same thing that Israel picked for themselves in the wilderness. If you remember Exodus 32. So there's that as well. Yes, Mark?
There is some that are saying, and I were not,
yeah.
Think postulated gods were not calf. God rode on the calf. So the idea that they chose the calf because they weren't really Jehovah.
Yeah.
Yahweh sat on the calf. I don't know if that's true.
That's admittedly a guess. I haven't really found anything that convincingly argues for that. But that is an idea that people sometimes put out there. The sea held 2,000 baths. That's about 10,000 to 11,000 gallons of water. Chronicles actually gives a different number on how much water it holds. But what was the point of it, though? What is this supposed to symbolize? I'm sorry? Okay, yeah, there's a purification that takes place as well. Why is it called a sea, though? Why not just call it a big bowl for washing? Sea sounds better. Okay, all right, yeah.
I only
It was done on a grand scale? Okay.
grandness.
Is the sea ever mentioned anywhere else in the Bible? Revelation, there you go. Yes, in Revelation, there's several places that the sea is mentioned, but two of the most prominent ones are in Revelation 4 and verse 6 and Revelation 15 and verse 2, where there is a sea before the throne of God. And Revelation 21, where he says that I saw new heavens and a new earth, he then comments, and there was no longer any sea. So he's describing this glorified temple, this glorified Jerusalem, and the sea is gone. Why would the sea be gone? No further need of cleansing. Okay, all right. So there's actually a lot more to this. The sea is kind of a way that the Bible tells its own story. You know, when you talk about the sea to ancient peoples, what would they have thought? It wouldn't have just been about cleansing. What else would it have been? Storms. Yeah. Was the sea a safe place to be? No. If you go into the sea, you usually wind up dead. The sea was untamable. It was a realm of chaos. You know, what's it doing in the temple, we might wonder. So there's all kinds of things we can look at that. But the Bible consistently, ancient mythology portrays the sea as something that the Canaanite gods would have to do battle with. You know, there's a myth about Baal, for instance, fighting an epic battle against Yam, the god of the sea. But the Bible portrays it differently. The Bible says it consistently portrays the sea as something at God's command. That's true in the Old Testament. That's true in the New Testament. That's why Jesus' disciples are so amazed when the sea obeys him. Because he commands it and it stops. The sea was untamable. Who is this that the wind and the waves obey him? The sea is sometimes used in Old Testament prophets as representative of the nations, like in Isaiah 17 or in Daniel 7. And the sea is sometimes the realm of the dead. Or we might think of another idea of the sea as one of separation. Anytime God wants to bring his people closer to himself, what has to happen? He has to bring them through water. When God was bringing Israel out of Egypt, what got in their way? The Red Sea. The Yam Suf. It was the thing that got in the way, and God divided the waters and brought them through it. They want to go into the land of Canaan. They want to come to the place where God has designated for their resting place. What do they got to do? They got to cross the Jordan River. They've got to pass through water. So God divides the waters to bring his people closer to himself. This happens several times in the Bible. Every time God's people want to come closer to him, they have to pass through water first. The tabernacle had a bronze laver. You had to wash before entry. The temple has a sea. You have to wash before entry into God's presence. What about us? Any application to us? Baptism. What? Yes, that's more or less correct. Before we can enter the temple of God, we must pass through water. We must pass through the sea, a place of death and of cleansing. Because what is baptism? Well, baptism is both of those things. It's a place where we die to sin in Christ, and it's a place where we are cleansed from our sins. So all of those things kind of converge on this image of the sea, and this is just one more piece of that image here in the temple. I might add that God even separates waters before he creates the world. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and it was God who said, "Let there be light," who tamed those waters, who separated those waters from each other and from the dry land, and planted the Garden of Eden. It's all had to happen for his first sanctuary to be built. And the removal of the sea has to happen before his final sanctuary is given to us in Revelation. In the new creation, there's no longer any sea, no longer any need for cleansing, no longer any realm of chaos, no longer any barrier between God and man, and no longer any death. That is what separates the true temple in heaven from the Temple of Solomon, which has a sea, which has a need for cleansing before entry. Anyhow, I think that that's kind of cool the way the Bible tells its own story there. But any thoughts or comments on that before we move on? All right, now verses 27 through 39 are a very, very long description of what is effectively these things. And there's several different pictures up here because we're not exactly sure what they look like even after reading all this description. But I'll just go ahead and read these verses because I suspect they don't get read very much in church. It says in verse 27, he made the 10 stands of bronze. The length of each stand was 4 cubits, and its width 4 cubits, and its height 3 cubits. This was the design of the stands. They had borders, even borders between the frames. On the borders, which were between the frames, were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames there was a pedestal above. Beneath the lions and oxen were wreaths of hanging work. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles. Its 4 feet had supports. Beneath the basin were cast supports with reeds at each side. Its opening inside the crown at the top was a cubit, and its opening was round, like the design of a pedestal, 1.5 cubits. And also on its opening there were engravings, and their borders were square, not round. The 4 wheels were underneath the borders, and the axles of the wheels were on the stand. And the height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The workmanship of the wheels was like the workmanship of a chariot wheel. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. Now there were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. Its supports were part of the stand itself. On the top of the stand there was a circular form 1/2 cubit high. On the top of the stand its stays and its borders were part of it. He engraved on the plates of its stays and on its borders cherubim, lions, and palm trees, according to the clear space on each, with reeds all around. He made the 10 stands like this. All of them had 1 casting, 1 measure, and 1 form. He made 10 basins of bronze. 1 basin held 40 baths. Each basin was 4 cubits, and on each of the 10 stands was 1 basin. He set the stands, 5 on the right side of the house, 5 on the left side of the house. He set the sea of cast metal on the right side of the house, eastward toward the south. All right, now, 2 Chronicles 4:6 reduces all of that to a single verse. I guess they just didn't feel like writing all that out again. Why are we told so much about these things? Why do you think we're told so much about this? It's in the Bible. That's a good point to make, definitely. Hey, does God care about I'm going to put this in quotes, insignificant details in worship? Yeah. It seems like he's very interested. Who considers, that's why it's in quotes. Yeah. Because, yes, Mark.
I recall the passage God compared sparrows. Sparrow does not fall without God's knowledge. Sparrows compared to the point there. But
that's like Luke 11 or 12. Yeah.
Yeah. Somewhere there. Cares the most significant animals. Cares about these things.
Yeah. Luke chapter 12, it says, verses 6 and 7, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents, yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, you are more valuable than many sparrows. So it's interesting that there's a lot of emphasis placed on the details of these things. Who decides what's insignificant? Well, it's not man's job to decide that. It's not man's job to decide what the little things are that are important. It's God's job to decide that. Okay, I guess the next question that we raise, though, is why focus on this as opposed to other stuff that's in the courtyard? Don. Right.
Most people God.
Okay, all right. Did you have something else, or? Oh, sorry, I thought it was all hand, but yeah. Well, yeah, I guess the question we have to raise is, why focus on this, as opposed to some of the other stuff that... There's a lot of stuff in this temple I'm curious about, aren't you? I mean, and the text doesn't answer all of our questions. The text does not answer questions, for instance, like how do priests get water out of the sea? I'm kind of wondering about that, and I've wondered about that for a while. I have no idea. How did the water get in? Yeah, I know, that's another good question. It's what? Yeah, it's like, these are like miniature seas, aren't they? They are. And what were they for? What were these things for? Cleansing. The priests were to wash in the sea, but everybody else was to wash in these 10 basins here. So much emphasis on this. Why? Because you can't get into the temple without cleansing. That's why. Because if you want to see how much stress, where's the stress of this text really being put? It's on the necessary cleansing. Because even though God is dwelling among His people in the temple, there's still something in the way. Their hands are still defiled. Not only can not many people enter this temple, but you got to wash yourself off before you can even go in. Because the people are filthy. Because they are defiled. Why? Sin. Because the sin problem isn't solved. And here is the real implicit, behind all the detail. Why is God so fascinated with the details of these things? Because this is where the focus is. This is where the problem is for mankind. Man needs this. He needs a wheeled water stand with all this intricate work to access God. He can't access God otherwise because cleansing is a problem. Defilement is still in the way. Now, if there's no longer any sea, will this be in the temple in the heavenly Jerusalem either? No. Because there will no longer be any need for cleansing. There will no longer be any sin or sorrow or pain or death or destruction. Because the Lord Himself has a greater source of cleansing for us in Christ. And just that, now we need to pass through water now to enter the temple of the living God. But there is a day coming when all of these restrictions will be removed. Here in Solomon's temple we see the tedious, it's tedious reading. I think it's done on purpose to get us to think. Why is God so fascinated with this aspect of it? Because this is what's holding man back. This is what's preventing man and God from getting to each other. It's the need for cleansing. So those are just some thoughts. Anybody else have anything else? Thoughts on this they want to share? I know that this is probably the most fascinating subject to all of you, and that when I finally published my devotional book on 1 Kings 7 verses 27 through 39, it'll be a big bestseller because that's what everybody wants to read. But all right. Okay, well, from verse 40 onward. Now Hiram made the basins and the shovels and the bowls. So Hiram finished doing all the work which he performed for King Solomon in the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals which were on the top of the 2 pillars, the 2 networks to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals which were on the top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 networks, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals which were on the top of the pillars, the 10 stands which the 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen under the sea, and the pails and the shovels and the bowls and all these utensils which Hiram made for King Solomon in the house of the Lord were polished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon left all the utensils unweighed because they were too many. The weight of the bronze could not be ascertained. Now there's a theory out there, and this may be correct, that when the Bible, when our English Bibles talk about bronze, the word should have actually been translated copper. It's hard to tell the difference. Bronze is a much more complex metal to manufacture than copper is. So at the very least, our modern definition of bronze is probably not what is meant by the ancient text. But basically what this is it's a list of stuff that was made. Hiram, he had a list of all the copper, bronze, whatever you call it stuff, the basins, shovels, bowls, pillars, these water carts, and the sea, and the pails, and the shovels, and the bowls. And presumably the altar as well, even though Kings doesn't mention the altar, Chronicles does. And there's so much of this copper that they're unable to weigh it. Solomon, he's not in charge of the copper stuff, he's in charge of the gold stuff. Verses 48 through 51, Solomon made all the furniture which was in the house of the Lord. The golden altar, the golden table on which was the bread of the presence, the lampstands, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary, of pure gold, the flowers, the lamps, the tongs of gold, the cups, the snuffers, the bowls, the spoons, the fire pans of pure gold, the hinges both for the doors of the inner house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the house, that is the nave, of the gold. Thus all the work that King Solomon performed in the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things dedicated by his father David, the silver and the gold and the utensils, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So, here's kind of the finished product, kind of a cutaway model, and just a general picture of what all of it might have looked like. You'll see that the stands are on the water carts on one side of the temple there, and the sea off to the right side, the altar off to the left side, and then the setup, the 3 chambers and the side rooms and all that. Solomon has to make a bunch of new furniture for this place. He makes gold furniture. What does he make specifically in the gold furniture? The lampstand. How many lampstands are there? 5 on each side, so 10 lampstands total. 10 stands on the outside, 10 lampstands on the inside. It kind of mirrors itself a little bit. As opposed to the tabernacle. The tabernacle only had 1 gold lampstand, and 1 table of showbread, and 1 gold altar. But Solomon makes a new table, a new altar, and 10 new lampstands for this thing. So all the tabernacle furniture is being remade, for whatever reason. There's only one piece of tabernacle furniture that is not remade. What is it? The Ark of the Covenant, correct. That is not made new. That is the same object. Well, the text stresses in chapter 8 that the ark, it's the same ark from when they made it in the wilderness that is brought into the temple. That has not changed. You know, some of God's furniture may change throughout the history, but God himself, the throne of God, has not been altered. God's presence has not been changed. Now, perhaps a contrived interpretation, but one to think about nonetheless. Now they have 10 times as much lighting as they did before. Just kind of another note of comparison, and this is just not in the Bible, but it's just kind of a for fun thing. The image on the left is Solomon's temple. The image on the right is the temple that existed in Jesus' day. This is to scale what the size comparison would have looked like. In Jesus' day, the temple got a lot bigger, got a lot taller, and it's got a much more elaborate court structure. And some of that had to do with the renovations that Herod had done just prior to him coming to earth. But it was as grand as Solomon's temple was, it seems like Herod was going out of his way to make it more grandiose than ever before. So, you know, when Haggai said the latter glory will be greater than the former, well, who knows if this might have been somewhat of what he had in mind. And actually down there at the bottom, I don't know if everybody can see, in the bottom corner, it compares the temple to a football field. And it is much larger than a football field. So just kind of give us some idea of what's going on here. Anyway, that's the construction of the temple in chapter 7. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, or questions on all that? Took 2 class sessions to get through it all, but yes, Don. Yes. Jen, you have something? One is not specified. No, it's not mentioned explicitly. And in fact, nothing outside of the inner court is explicitly discussed in Solomon's temple. And the inner court even gets like a couple of verses at most. There is a temple that Ezekiel describes in Ezekiel 40, 41, 42, which some people think has the same basic dimensions as Solomon's temple. But Ezekiel gets into a lot more detail on things that the biblical account in Kings doesn't mention. Now some people just want to say that that's a different thing altogether. I'm kind of not sure what I think about that. That's one of those questions I'm still got to dig into a little deeper. Could be. I don't know if I don't know if a women's court is actually mentioned in the Bible outside of what we see in the New Testament, actually. But it appears to have been, I guess, just another layer of restriction that had been built around the temple. Now, you could still enter the women's court if you were a Jew. Once you entered the court of the women and you weren't a Jew, you were basically taking your life into your own hands in that instance. Don said something that raises another question. The tabernacle is said to have been built according to the pattern, Exodus 25. Is that ever said of the temple? Don's shaking his head no. Anybody care to disagree? Or? I'm sorry, I can't hear. You'd think it did. Did it mention it in Kings? No passage we've read in Kings thus far has mentioned that it was built according to the pattern. But this is why it's helpful to read Chronicles. Look at 1 Chronicles chapter 28. 1 Chronicles 28 in verse 19. Now, and David's just giving Solomon a huge list of stuff he's going to build in the temple. What is it? You stand here. Well, I mean, it's one of those. Chronicles is the tough book that nobody ever reads because it's I don't know what we can say about it. There's a lot more. It can get a lot more tedious than Kings, even with the listing of the names and the construction reports and all that. But it gives us important information, I think. Yeah. Right, but in verse 19, David said, "All this the Lord has made me understand in writing by His hand upon me all the details of this pattern." So just as Moses was given a pattern by God, David was given a pattern by God too. Set of instructions by which he might build the temple. So the idea that David just kind of, or that Solomon was just kind of making it up as he went and they were just kind of winging it. No. What we have here is a situation where the temple is definitely constructed according to a pattern that God gave. Of course, the true temple is still in heaven. And it is the one after which the tabernacle and the temple on earth are modeled. Where is the real blueprint? Well, the blueprint's up there. And today, what is consistently... The New Testament talks about the pattern or the example that we're supposed to follow. And what is that example and pattern consistently that we're supposed to follow? What does it say? Well, no, I mean, I should have phrased the question better. Yes, we shouldn't add to or take away from the Scriptures. What is the pattern that we are supposed to imitate? Jesus. Yes, there you go. The answer is always Jesus. That's a... But yes, that's right as well. We should not add to nor take away. We can't just make stuff up. That much is clear. When the Lord has made His will known on something, it's not licensed for us to go, well, God didn't say not to do this, so I can just go do whatever I want. No, that's not what the Scriptures allow for. We discussed this some in our last Q&A session. The idea that God doesn't say not to do something is not in and of itself sufficient grounds for doing something. Well, you threw hot coals in my face. Well, you didn't tell me not to. That just doesn't work very well. Yes, Keith, go.
I was going to say, sincerity. Sincerity counts.
Sincerity, well, sincerity is necessary. Yeah.
If we are not.
Well, that's a tough thing. I mean, and I don't want to get into the role of the judgment seat of God, obviously, because at the end of the day, only the Lord knows people's hearts. Only the Lord can decide who is and is not going to heaven. Now, are there things that we have fallen short on? Possibly. Well, I would hope that, if we have, someone would point to the Scriptures and say, here's where you've erred. And if we have the sincere heart, we would naturally be willing to change ourselves to conform to said description. Now, here's the question, of course. We mentioned this a few weeks ago in the story of Nadab and Abihu. They offer strange fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded. And the Lord destroys them. That's very sudden, very swift, very shocking, and it's done on purpose to get us to ask, whoa, how seriously does God take this? But you got to keep reading Leviticus 10, because the very next thing that happens is what? Well, Aaron breaks another law. He doesn't eat the portion of the sin offering that was specified. And Moses is really up in arms about this and incensed. Aaron, why didn't you do this? You're going to bring the wrath of the Lord on us again. And Aaron gives his reason. He says, I was afraid. What if the Lord, and he gives on, after these events had happened to me today, would it have been appropriate for me to do that? Would the Lord have been pleased with me? And that is a question that we need to ask, is will the Lord be pleased with this? And if our approach to worship is, what is the Lord pleased with? Inevitably we will turn to the Scriptures. And if we make a mistake, then, the Lord hopefully will be merciful to us in our motives. If our approach, however, is, well, I don't really care what the Lord's pleased with. This is about me and what I want to do. And I don't really care what's pleasing to the Lord. I want to go do my own thing. Well, then it looks a little different, right? Then the situation is much, much different. We have a much different problem, and that's a problem of the heart. And so I would say motive definitely matters. Exactly, there are instances in the Bible where people's ignorance does not save them. So we need to keep that in mind as well. But there are instances in the Bible where people's ignorance does save them. Exactly what the difference is, I couldn't tell you. I just know that the judge of all the earth will judge rightly. So that's my short answer to that, anyway. Now, we've got a few minutes left. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 8. The longest chapter in the whole book, and we probably won't get through all of it in the time we have remaining. Much, much richer text for application than some of what we read before. And can I get a volunteer to read the first 11 verses of chapter 8, the culmination of everything we've just read? All right. This passage right here marks the fulfillment of David's wish. The ark was dwelling in a tent, but they moved the ark into a paneled house of cedar. Now, and that's the big event in these verses. Moving the ark inside the temple. And when the ark moves into the temple, what happens? The cloud moves into the temple too. The glory of the Lord moves into the temple. Now this is incredible feat. Where else do we see this event happening in the Bible? When Israel first came out of the land of Egypt, they built the tabernacle. It was at the very end of the book of Exodus. The cloud fills the temple, fills the tabernacle. You see how interchangeable they really are when I'm confusing the two. The cloud fills the tabernacle and the priests cannot stand to enter. Moses cannot even enter. That's what's going on here. This is a busy day. This would have been during the Feast of Tabernacles. And they have a lot of sacrifices to offer. They're offering so many that it can't be counted. And right in the middle of all this thing, the glory of the Lord fills the house and the priests can't get in. Their work is actually interrupted for the presence of God, for His grand entrance into the temple. Now that's the basic idea that's given here. We're going to have more to say about this next time because we can't say all of it now. Jen, what is it? I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying, please. So kind of like a Sabbath? Kind of like a Sabbath. Well, yeah, except that, the priests work more on the Sabbath than any other day, actually. So that's what's going on there, more or less. All right, well, we're out of time. We're going to pick up and discuss these verses a little more next time, and hopefully the rest of chapter 8 as well. We'll see how much we can get of that. Thank you all for your time and your comments.